All right, folks, we got another just real quick transition here as Al Kaufman comes up. The next item on our agenda is for Al to provide an overview of the upcoming revisions to F963, some of the balloting issues that will go on, the process and timing, and Al is now going to join us and give you a full update on that.
Good morning, and thanks for coming. I know a lot of you come to the safety update for this presentation and for several others that we have had or will have a little later in the program. I'm going to talk a little bit about F963 and what we anticipate for the next revision of the standard. Obviously, as you know, the latest revision is the one that was published in very late 2011. It was endorsed by the CPSC by unanimous vote in March 2012 and became a mandatory federal rule in June of 2012. And third-party testing and certification is required for products that are within the scope of the standard for those requirements within F963 which apply to that particular standard. So let's talk about what we anticipate. We do anticipate having, and I'll talk a little bit later about timeline, but we do anticipate having a standard, a -16 version of the standard published sometime this year. So some of the changes, and you may have heard some of these before because we've been working on a lot of these revisions over several years. Some of them are already in the can, so to speak. They've been through the balloting process. They're ready to be published. However, we always try to balance how often we update the standard because we recognize that when we do a revision, that means people have to go out and purchase a new version of the standard. In many cases, that means they need to retest their product to the new version of the standard, and so there's obviously a balance. You want to update the standard frequently enough to keep pace with innovation in the industry and also emerging hazards that we become aware of, but you also don't want to do it so often that there's a constant churn of required testing and required purchase of that standard. So, magnets, we've made some changes to align with both ISO 8124 and EN 71. We've added the soaking test and the compression test from those standards because we thought that was a good idea, particularly for wooden toys which contain magnets. We've aligned the gaussmeter specs and the specified metal disc if you only have a single magnet so that they align with those standards as well. And we've made a number of other miscellaneous changes which are relatively minor but again bring us into substantial alignment with the international standard, ISO 8124, and also the European Union standard, EN 71. And that should act to reduce testing burden because hopefully only a single test will be required for all three standards. For projectiles, we're making changes again to align with ISO and EN 71. The allowable kinetic energy density is now 2,500 joules per square meter. We've added the 57 millimeter length requirement for suction cup darts, and this was something that was added to both EN and ISO based on the fact that there were a couple of incidents where even though a projectile was not a small part, there were still some gagging incidents, and so therefore we felt it made sense to add this requirement. So in addition to projectiles not being allowed to be small parts, as has been in the standard for some time, we're also adding this 57 millimeter length requirement for certain projectiles. There are additional mouth actuated toy requirements. When we looked at the standard, this was not essentially involved in alignment, but when we looked at the standard, we realized that the standard was not as complete as we felt it should be, and so we've put some other requirements in there for mouth actuated projectile toys, such as blowguns. We've added a new gauge for the leading edge radius requirement for rigid projectiles. There has always been a 2 millimeter radius requirement. I shouldn't say always, but for quite some time there's been a 2 millimeter radius requirement for rigid projectiles. The problem was that measuring that sometimes could be very difficult, especially if you didn't have an optical comparator. And so what we have done is, while we have not changed the requirement itself, we have added a gauge which makes measurement of that radius much more readily done and much simpler. And there are other miscellaneous changes, again, relatively minor. Okay, there we go. Microbiological safety. This one, again, is in the can. It's ready to go. We clarified the requirements. I think this was an area where there was a lot of confusion, both in terms of what products are required to undergo microbiological testing, but also once you did the testing, what was considered to be a failure and what was not. And so what we did was we put in some very specific limits for plate counts. For the microbial challenge test or the preservative effectiveness test, we actually put together for the first time a list of organisms, a minimum list of organisms that needed to be tested. And we also put in specific requirements for the reduction in those populations over certain time periods. And then on top of that, we also looked at it and said we've traditionally or historically used the U.S. pharmacopoeia requirements for the testing method, but we felt that there were some other alternatives out there that probably did a better job of addressing most toys, and specifically the Cosmetic Toiletry and Fragrance Association has a series of guidelines that have been out for many years, and we felt that rather than pharmaceuticals, which the USP was intended to address, the CTFA guidelines, which were intended for cosmetics, probably were more appropriate for most toys. So we allowed that as an alternative method to the USP, although you can still use USP if you choose to do so. The stuffing cleanliness method, we actually simplified the test method. The one that was in the standard was relatively complex and frankly, it didn't do as good a job as we felt it could. In terms of assuring stuffing cleanliness, and so we did simplify that method, and we think we've not only improved safety of the product, but also made the test simpler at the same time. So we felt pretty good about that. Expanding toys, we've proposed a new requirement and test method, and I'll talk a little bit about where that is. This at this point is not final. There are some negatives that need to be resolved, so I'll talk about that a little bit later. But you're probably all aware that there were some incidents a year or so ago where children swallowed expanding superabsorbent polymer balls that then expanded in their digestive tract and required surgical or medical intervention to remove because they got stuck and the child couldn't pass them. There is ASTM F963 really didn't have an expanding toy requirement. However, ISO and EN71 have had one for quite a while, and we first looked at that and said, okay, can we simply adopt the ISO and EN standard? We looked at it and said, yes, this probably would be effective in preventing those types of items from being included in toys, but unfortunately it also would have excluded a number of other items that have been in the marketplace for many, many years and have been incident-free. For instance, sponges. If you have a sponge that's dry and has been compressed and you put it in water, it's going to expand more than 50%, which is the ISO and EN test. So what we elected to do was we've developed a gauge and a test method which are based on the anatomy of an 18-month-old child's digestive tract, and we're going to use that instead. And in fact, we've heard some positive noise from both ISO and EN that once we get that into the standard that they will probably align with us. So hopefully we'll be able to achieve that as well. Pen caps. This is one we spent a fair amount of time looking at pen caps that are pens, markers, pencils, all sorts of writing or coloring instruments that are included in toys. There is an existing ISO standard, 11540, which mandates that either the cap, a detachable cap on one of these instruments has to either not pass through a 16-millimeter ring gauge, or it has to have ventilation and a minimum amount of airflow, so that if a child does manage to inhale it, that they can still breathe through it. Also, the fact that you've added that ventilation would tend to eliminate a vacuum, so it makes it less likely the child is going to inhale it. So we did look at that based on some initial reports that there were some non-compliant products that had created at least one incident that was fatal. When we dug a little deeper after we had done some of the work, CPSC was able to provide some nice data that indicated that There were very few incidents over a very long period of time. It didn't seem to rise to the level of an emerging hazard, as we typically would characterize it. And also, even when we looked at some of the items that were involved in incidents, they appeared to be compliant. I mean, this is a standard that seems to be almost universally observed. And so the working group said, look, number one, we don't have the data to really support this. And number two, even if we decided to put it into the standard, we probably wouldn't accomplish much because everybody's already complying with it anyway. So that one is essentially tabled at this point until additional data becomes available, but that probably will not make it into the -16 version of the standard, although you may have heard that we were working on it. Heavy elements, we have some clarifying amendments. These don't change the requirements at all, but when we published the -11 version, we've received a number of requests for interpretation, some of those repetitively, and so we felt that it was important to put those clarifying requirements in place so that we addressed those concerns and made the standard clearer in terms of what was required. The working group is considering the addition of HDXRF for a total screen for certain homogeneous polymers, polymeric materials. Not sure whether this one will make the -16 version of the standard. There are some negatives that need to be resolved. They seem to be fairly intractable, and I think we're going to have to address those at an F1522 meeting on March 4th, which is currently scheduled for Washington. Some miscellaneous changes, a strap exemption, obviously, for ride-on toys. There were some ride-on toys that actually had a safety harness to hold a young child into the ride-on toy. That clearly was not able to meet the length requirements for straps, and so we put an exemption in place because we felt that if the product was such that it was important to have a safety harness, that probably overrode the issue of potential strangulation, particularly if it was attached at 3 points. A curb impact test for ride-on toys was added. We further clarified the overload and stability requirements for ride-on toys and toy seats. And we made it clear that non-powered scooters are not part of F963. They're part of an existing standard, ASTM F963. So those are the miscellaneous changes that'll be in the -16, and these are all essentially in the can and ready to go. Okay, coin and button cell batteries. Even though the toy standard has had for many years a very effective requirement for battery inaccessibility, particularly for cells which are small parts, which coin and button cells would be, there were a number of incidents. Usually the product was not a toy. It was a television remote control or something along those lines. However, we looked at this and said, you know, this is a hazard that is not well appreciated by the public. It's not even well appreciated sometimes by emergency room physicians, who are usually the first to see these issues when the child presents. And so we felt that we wanted to do our part in helping to disseminate that information among the public. So even though toys were not really involved in these incidents, except that batteries that were taken out of toys and then left around might have been, but children accessing the batteries from toys was just not an issue. We still felt that we had a responsibility to help spread the word, that this can be a real issue if a child manages to swallow one of these batteries, it gets stuck in the throat, and within a very short period of time, you can have the battery burning through the tissue and creating a real issue. In fact, in some cases, it has been fatal. So, lithium-ion batteries. In response to some incident data on typically small toy helicopters when they were charged. We've worked very closely with some of the electrical engineering people at CPSC to develop some requirements for temperature and current limiting on lithium-ion batteries, charging requirements for lithium-ion batteries, and we've partially aligned with the IEC standard 62115, but not completely. Because we wanted to strike a balance between reducing testing burden and just making sure that we had solidly addressed the issue. Acoustics, we've partially aligned with EN71 And we've added for the first time a push-pull toy definition, which we always referred to in the standard, but we realized that we never had a definition for it, so it was sort of a miss. Okay, timing. There's a subcommittee meeting, as I mentioned, scheduled for March 4th. There are several negatives that have to be resolved and probably reballoted, if nothing else, to confirm those negatives with the larger committee, the F-15 committee, on projectiles, on expanding toys, and on HDXRF. The last round of the reballot, if necessary, will commence very shortly after the meeting. It'll end 30 days later. Assuming that there are no additional negatives which come up in that second round of balloting, it would then go into the editing stage, which is probably 30 to 45 days generally, and publication would be shortly thereafter. ASTM typically notifies the commission on the same day that it's published, and so statutorily, CPSC has 90 days to act on that standard. And if they feel that it does not improve safety, they can reject that standard. However, we feel that because CPSC and also Health Canada, for that matter, have been closely involved in a lot of these requirements, that it's not going to be an issue. If CPSC approves the standard or does not act within those 90 days, it becomes a mandatory federal rule 180 days after publication. So that would probably be sometime in the fourth quarter of 2016. So we will have a mandatory federal standard that we can talk to you about next year, ASTM F963-16. So with that, I'll take questions. Yes. Get you a microphone, Haley. Right here.
Haley Mann, American Plastic Toys. I have a question about the curb impact for ride-on toys. Is it for non-powered foot-to-floor or powered or both?
It primarily intended for non-powered, and in fact, what it does is it mimics the curb impact test that is currently in ANSI Z315, the tricycle standard. However, I don't think we made a distinction between powered and non-powered.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? And surely I didn't do that good a job of explaining what was going on. Okay, thank you very much. Oh, Fred? Okay, we have one question up front here.
Fred Mills Winkler, SGS. You didn't mention toy chests.
Good question, Fred. Yeah, there is, as just a little history, toy chests used to be in the ASTM F963 standard going back to the 2007 version of the standard, ASTM F963-2007 E1. What we did at that time when the standard was still voluntary was we felt that toy chests probably deserved their own standard. So a separate standard was actually developed for toy chests, and then toy chests were moved out of the ASTM F963 standard with the -08 version. However, when Congress mandated the standard, the -08 version was accepted with the exception that toy chests, that -07 E1 standard was actually still remained mandatory. And so there has been a proposal to move that back in. We've actually tried to move it back into the -08 standard. Joan, I think there are still some outstanding negatives on that one that have to be resolved. Yes. So that hopefully will make the -16 version of the standard. However, those toy chest requirements still remain mandatory. In other words, there would not be any change in the standard. They would just be moved back into the -16 version, so it's a little cleaner, so you don't have to refer back to the -07 version. So, but no changes in the standard. Other questions? Yes. Can you wait for the microphone so people can hear you? Thanks.
Al, good morning. So a non-powered scooter is not a toy?
Non-powered scooters are covered by that separate standard F2264. Now, a lot of the requirements mirror F963, but it got very confusing. I mean, obviously, tricycles are covered by a separate standard. Non-powered scooters are covered by a separate standard. Powered scooters are covered by a separate standard. And we were just trying to make clear that there was this whole other standard out there that included a lot of the same requirements, but was really specific to that type of product.
Thank you.
Other questions? Now we have one back here.
John Cavallo with Travelers. Is there any expectation that a developer of new toys, designer, would conduct a hazard analysis of the product?
It's not part of the standard. However, we would certainly expect that as part of any design process, that a risk analysis is conducted. I wouldn't say hazard analysis. I would say you have to analyze the hazard, but you also have to look at risk. And then you obviously also have to look at all of the standards which apply to that product as you're doing that analysis. So even though it's not part of the standard, yes, that would be the expectation, that that's part of a design process.
Alfred again, sorry. Back on the scooter question. I believe the ASTM F963 has a age requirement as well and applies to scooters like the metal ones with the folding handles, etc. A toy scooter, which is made of all plastic and has got 4 wheels on it or something intended for a 2-year-old, I think would still be under the toy standard. Correct.
If it is outside the scope, and it gets a little tricky here, if it's outside the scope of the F2264 standard and it is primarily intended for play, in other words, there's play value to it rather than being a transportation device, as some of the scooters for older kids are, the metal ones, for instance, then yes, it would be part of F963. Anyone else? Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.